In 1789, the United States was nothing more than an idea on a piece of paper. It had no money, no army, and no guarantee it would survive the year. But in just 4 decades, the impossible happened. We went from a single man, George Washington, inventing the presidency from scratch, to a nation that doubled its size overnight with a single land deal. We survived a civil war within the cabinet between Hamilton and Jefferson, and watched our own capital burn to the ground in the heat of a second war for independence. But as the borders pushed west, the revolution moved inward. From the marble halls of D.C. to the wild fire-lit camp meetings of the frontier, Americans weren't just building a country, they were reinventing their souls. This is the story of how a fragile experiment became a continental power. This is the rise of the American Republic. Before we begin this incredible story, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment below telling us which other famous civilization you would like to see in a future video. The Washington Experiment. March 4th, 1789. The United States was a country on paper, but a ghost in reality. The old government had collapsed, the treasury was empty, the army, barely a militia. The world was watching, waiting for the American experiment to fail. They needed more than a politician, they needed a myth. And there was only one man the people trusted with the keys to a brand new kingdom: George Washington, the hero who led a starving army to victory and then did the unthinkable. He gave his power back. Now the nation was asking him to take it up one more time. On April 30th, standing above the crowded streets of New York, Washington placed his hand on the Bible. His voice was steady as he uttered the words every president has repeated for over 2 centuries: preserve, protect, and defend. But as he stepped into Federal Hall, he realized the terrifying truth. There was no roadmap. There were no federal courts, no tax system, no navy. The Constitution was a set of rules, but Washington had to build the house. He didn't do it alone. He gathered the greatest and most clashing minds of the age: Thomas Jefferson at State, Alexander Hamilton at Treasury. Washington played the mediator, turning these department heads into what we now call the cabinet. He wasn't just leading a country, he was inventing the machinery of democracy from scratch. While Washington built the government in the East, the country was exploding toward the West. Settlers were pouring into the Ohio Valley, Kentucky, and Tennessee. This wasn't just a coastal strip anymore. It was becoming a continent-bound giant. Immigrants arrived with new languages and trades, while the first gears of the Industrial Revolution began to grind in New England textile mills. By 1790, American merchant ships weren't just hugging the coast. They were docking in China, trading furs for silk and spices. Under Washington's watch, the U.S. had become the second greatest maritime power on Earth, trailing only Britain. The Great Divide. Hamilton versus Jefferson. The Revolution was over. The British were gone, but a new war was beginning. One fought not with muskets, but with ideas. 2 men, both brilliant, both patriots, and both sitting at George Washington's own table, held 2 completely different maps for the future of America. In one corner, Alexander Hamilton, the immigrant prodigy who wanted to build a financial superpower. In the other, Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher aristocrat who dreamed of a nation of independent farmers. This wasn't just a policy debate, it was the birth of the American 2-party system, and it was about to get ugly. To Alexander Hamilton, the future was made of iron, steam, and silver. He looked at the wreckage of the post-war economy and saw a solution: credit. He argued that if the U.S. wanted to be a world power, it had to act like one. That meant paying off every cent of the war debt to prove the new nation was a safe bet for investors. Hamilton's vision was a top-down America. He wanted a national bank, a national mint, and protective tariffs to jumpstart American factories. He believed that a strong central government was the only thing keeping the country from sliding back into chaos. To Hamilton, order was the ultimate virtue. But Thomas Jefferson looked at Hamilton's banks and factories and saw something else: tyranny. To Jefferson, cities were sores on the body politic. He believed that true liberty only existed when a man owned his own land and answered to no one. He didn't want a strong government, he wanted a small one. While Hamilton admired the stability of the British Empire, Jefferson was inspired by the fire of the French Revolution. He feared that Hamilton's national bank was just a backdoor way for the wealthy to enslave the common man through debt. The stage was set for a constitutional showdown. The breaking point came over the bank. Jefferson pointed at the Constitution. "Show me where it says the government can build a bank. It's not there. If it's not written, you can't do it." Hamilton fired back with a revolutionary idea: implied powers. He argued that the necessary and proper clause gave Congress the flexibility to do whatever it took to keep the nation solvent. It was a battle over how to read the law. Is the Constitution a rigid set of chains or a living, breathing document? George Washington listened to both. In the end, he signed Hamilton's bill. The bank was born. Hamilton won the battle of the bank, but the war for the American identity was just beginning. These two men defined the two poles of American politics, one favoring the federal, the other the local, one focusing on the economy, the other on individual liberty. The Revolution united Americans against a king, but Hamilton and Jefferson taught us how to disagree, and yet, somehow, remain one nation. The debate they started in the 1790s, we're still having it today. The Citizen Genet Crisis. In 1793, George Washington had one goal: survival. The United States was a newborn, fragile, debt-ridden, and exhausted. It needed time to breathe. It needed peace. But across the ocean, the world was screaming. The French Revolution had turned into a bloodbath. King Louis XVI had met the guillotine, and France was now at war with every monarchy in Europe, most importantly, the British Empire. Suddenly, America's perpetual alliance with France wasn't just a treaty, it was a fuse, and a man named Citizen Genet was coming to light it. Enter Edmond Charles Genet. He didn't come to talk to the government, he came to talk to the people. Americans loved him. They saw France as their brothers in arms. But Washington saw a trap. If the U.S. helped France, the British Navy would wipe the American economy off the map in a weekend. Washington's move. On April 22, he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality. It was a cold, hard no to both sides. But Citizen Genet didn't care about neutrality. He began illegally hiring American ships to attack British vessels. When the U.S. government told him to stop, he did the unthinkable. He threatened to go over Washington's head and appealed directly to the American voters. He had crossed the line. The Genet affair didn't just cause a diplomatic crisis, it lit a fire of division between Americans that would never truly go out. While Genet was causing chaos from within, the British were squeezing from without. The Royal Navy was seizing American ships and impressing sailors, kidnapping them and forcing them to serve the British crown. On the frontier, British troops still occupied forts on American soil, arming tribes to resist Western expansion. War seemed inevitable.
To stop it, Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to London to cut a deal. The result? Jay's Treaty. It was underwhelming. The British agreed to leave the forts, but they refused to stop kidnapping sailors or seizing ships. To the Federalists, it was a necessary compromise to avoid a suicidal war. To the Republicans, it was a humiliating betrayal of American honor. At the same time, Thomas Pinckney managed to win a massive victory with Spain, securing the port of New Orleans. But even that couldn't stop the bleeding at home. Foreign policy had become domestic warfare. To the Federalists, the pro-French Republicans were dangerous radicals who wanted to bring the guillotine to Philadelphia. To the Republicans, the pro-British Federalists were secret monarchists who wanted to crawl back to the king. The United States had won its independence from an empire, but now it was learning the hardest lesson of all. In a world ruled by giants, staying neutral is the most dangerous job of all.
The breaking point, the birth of modern politics. For 8 years, George Washington was the glue holding a fragile America together. But in 1797, he did the unthinkable. He walked away. For the first time, the United States was truly on its own. The election that followed wasn't just a vote, it was a collision. In one corner, the blunt, stubborn Federalist John Adams. In the other, his own vice president and rival, Thomas Jefferson. Adams won the seat, but he inherited a house on fire. Across the ocean, France was furious. They saw America's new friendship with Britain as a betrayal and began seizing American ships by the hundreds. Adams tried to talk peace, but France's response was an insult that nearly ignited a world war. 3 secret French agents, known only as X, Y, and Z, demanded a massive bribe just to start negotiations. The American public was outraged. The cry went up, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. An undeclared naval war broke out. Hamilton and the High Federalists screamed for a full-scale invasion of France. But Adams stood his ground. He chose a pen over a sword, negotiating a peace that saved the country but cost him his political career. While war loomed abroad, a war on liberty started at home. Caught in a wave of anti-French paranoia, Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. It became a crime to criticize the government. Editors were jailed. Immigrants were threatened with deportation. To the Republicans, this was the death of the Revolution. Jefferson and Madison fought back from the shadows, drafting resolutions that argued states could nullify federal laws they found unconstitutional. The Union was stretching to its breaking point. By the election of 1800, the people had had enough of high taxes and government overreach. The campaign was the dirtiest in history, but when the dust settled, Thomas Jefferson emerged victorious. The world waited for the coup, for the soldiers to take the streets, but it never happened. John Adams left the city in the middle of the night. For the first time in modern history, a government changed hands from one warring party to another without a single drop of blood being spilled. Jefferson's America was different. He walked to his own inauguration. He slashed spending. He cut the national debt in half. He envisioned a wise and frugal government that stayed out of the way of its citizens. The 1990s had been a trial by fire. The Constitution had been pushed to the edge by partisan fury and foreign threats. But as Jefferson took the oath in the new capital of Washington, D.C., the experiment had been proven. America didn't just survive, it was becoming a democracy. The Louisiana Gamble and the Road to War. In 1801, the American dream was facing a bottleneck. The Mississippi River was the lifeblood of the frontier, but the keys to the river belonged to Napoleon Bonaparte.
If France built an empire in Louisiana, the United States would be trapped, strangled against the Atlantic. Jefferson was so desperate, he even considered an unthinkable alliance with his old enemy, Great Britain. But then, history took a sharp, unexpected turn. A revolution in Haiti and a looming war in Europe forced Napoleon's hand. He didn't just want to sell a city, he wanted to sell a continent. Napoleon's offer was staggering: 800,000 square miles for $15 million. It was the deal of a lifetime, but for Thomas Jefferson, it was a legal nightmare. The Constitution didn't say a word about buying foreign land. Jefferson, the man who preached strict construction of the law, had to choose: stick to his principles and lose the land, or break his own rules to save the future. He took the deal. In 1803, with the stroke of a pen, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the Republic. America had its heartland. But expansion didn't bring peace, it brought a target. By 1805, the world was at war again. Britain ruled the waves, France ruled the land, and caught in the middle, American merchants. The British Navy began impressing American sailors, literally kidnapping them at sea and forcing them into service for the crown. Jefferson was furious, but he didn't want a bloodbath. He chose a different weapon: the Embargo Act. He shut down all American trade. He thought he could starve the world into respecting America. Instead, he starved his own people. Ships rotted in New York harbors. Farmers in the South went broke. The peaceful solution was destroying the country from within. By 1809, the embargo was dead, but the anger was alive. James Madison inherited a nation on the brink. In the Northwest, settlers blamed British agents for fueling Native American resistance. In Washington, war hawks demanded honor and the conquest of Canada. The insults had piled too high to ignore. On June 18, 1812, for the second time in 30 years, the United States declared war on Great Britain. A young nation was stepping back into the ring, ready to prove once and for all that it could stand among the giants of the world. The War of 1812. In 1812, the United States did something that looked like suicide. With a tiny army of 7,000 men and a nation deeply divided, it declared war on the most powerful empire on earth, Great Britain. The North called it Mr. Madison's War and threatened to leave the Union. The South and West demanded blood for American honor. It was a war the young republic wasn't ready to fight, and it was about to be pushed to the very brink of extinction. The opening act was a disaster. An invasion of Canada collapsed in humiliation, ending with the British capture of Detroit. Americans were overconfident and underprepared. But where the army failed, the Navy soared. On the high seas, American super frigates like the USS Constitution stunned the world by outdueling British warships. On the Great Lakes, Oliver Hazard Perry turned the tide. After a brutal, blood-soaked battle on Lake Erie, he sent a message that would echo through history: "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." The Northwest was back in American hands, but the heart of the nation was still in the crosshairs. August 1814, the unthinkable happened. British troops marched into Washington, D.C., scattering the American militia like leaves in the wind. President Madison was forced to flee as the British set the Capitol ablaze. The President's house, the Capitol, the Library of Congress, all consumed by fire. It was the darkest hour in American history. The American experiment looked like it was finally going up in smoke. Across the Atlantic, both sides were exhausted. A peace treaty was signed in Ghent on Christmas Eve, 1814. But in the age of sail, news traveled slow. 2 weeks after the war was officially over, the British launched a massive assault on New Orleans. Standing in their way was a ragtag army of frontiersmen, pirates, and free men of color, led by a gritty general named Andrew Jackson. In a stunning, lopsided victory, Jackson's men decimated the British regulars. The news of the peace treaty and Jackson's victory hit the streets at the exact same time. To the American public, it didn't feel like a draw, it felt like a triumph. The war settled almost nothing on paper. No borders changed, no rights were officially won. But for the American soul, everything had changed. The Federalist Party, which had whispered of secession during the war, was branded as disloyal and vanished from history. In its place rose a new, fierce national pride. The United States had faced the world's greatest superpower, seen its capital burn, and survived. The experiment was over. The American nation was no longer a question mark. It was a permanent force on the continent.
The Great Fire. By the year 1800, the fire of the American spirit was cooling. The Enlightenment had made faith a thing of the mind, quiet, intellectual, and distant. The pews were emptying, and the old colonial churches were losing their grip. But history hates a vacuum. At the dawn of the 19th century, a spiritual earthquake shook the young republic. It wasn't a whisper, it was a roar. It would be called the Second Great Awakening, and it wouldn't just change how Americans prayed, it would change how they lived, how they voted, and how they fought for the soul of their country. In upstate New York, the revival burned so hot they gave the region a nickname, the Burned Over District. There was no more fuel left to catch fire because the preachers had been through so many times. The superstar of this movement was Charles Grandison Finney. A lawyer turned preacher, Finney used logic and high-energy oratory to trap his audience. He didn't just want your soul, he wanted your hands. Out of this spiritual hothouse, entire new religions were born, including the Latter-day Saint movement and the Seventh-day Adventists. America's spiritual map was expanding just as fast as its borders. But if New England was a controlled burn, the frontier was a wildfire. In the rugged backcountry of Kentucky and Tennessee, life was lonely and dangerous. To escape the isolation, thousands of pioneers traveled for miles to attend camp meetings. At the legendary Cane Ridge Revival 1801, nearly 25,000 people gathered in the woods. This wasn't a quiet Sunday service. It was an explosion of singing, shouting, and the jerks, a physical release of years of pent-up emotion. For these settlers, faith wasn't a philosophy, it was a lifeline. As the people moved west, the church followed on horseback. The Methodist circuit riders were the commandos of the movement, riding thousands of miles to reach the most remote cabins in the wilderness. Meanwhile, the Baptists surged by empowering local farmer preachers, men who spoke the language of the common person. By the time the dust settled, the old, rigid denominations of the colonial era were being overtaken by these populist, high-energy faiths. But the Second Great Awakening didn't end when the camp meetings packed up. It fueled a massive wave of social reform. If you believed you could save your soul, you believed you could save your country. This religious fervor became the engine behind the movements to abolish slavery, promote temperance, and fight for women's rights. The Second Great Awakening proved that America was a nation in motion, restless, diverse, and searching for a higher purpose. In the forest and the city, Americans were redefining what it meant to believe, and in doing so, they were redefining what it meant to be a nation.